If I'd stopped him that night, maybe Dad's voice would have stayed buried. But I pressed play. It began with a sound I hadn't heard in 20 years, that slow, crackling hum of an old VHS tape coming to life. The kind of sound that doesn't just fill a room, it fills your chest like memory trying to breathe again. We were up in Dad's attic, surrounded by dust wooden beams and the smell of old insulation. It was supposed to be a simple cleanup after the funeral, but nothing in that house was ever simple. Emily was the one who found it, a plain black tape in a faded box with white letters scribbled across the label. Birthday, D8. Dad and the kids. She laughed when she blew the dust off. Mark didn't. He froze. Before I could ask why she pushed the tape into the old player we'd found in a trunk, the screen flickered to life, gray lines dancing across it like ghosts waking up. And then a woman's voice, soft, warm, familiar. "Mark, promise me you'll never forget what this house means." The room went quiet. Mark lunged forward, almost tripping over the cord. "Turn it off," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't know what's on it." He was pale, breathing hard, not angry, afraid. Emily looked at him confused. "It's just Mom," she whispered. "Why are you?" But Mark didn't answer. He just stared at the screen as if it could kill him. He said it was nothing, but I knew it was everything. Some memories don't fade, they rot. Would you dare to play a tape that someone begged you to forget? After Dad's funeral, the house felt wrong. Not just empty wrong. The funeral itself had been small. A few old colleagues from the school, a handful of neighbors, and us, his children, pretending we still knew how to stand next to each other. When everyone left, the quiet didn't just return. It spread, crawling into every room, every chair, every framed photo. You could almost hear the house sigh. Even the air felt different, like it was holding its breath. The smell of flowers still clung to the walls, mixed with coffee and rain. That kind of silence isn't peaceful. It's the kind that waits for someone to break it. And no one did. Like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave again. The walls still smelled like his pipe tobacco and lemon polish. The curtains hadn't moved in months. There was a thin layer of dust on everything, like time had paused the moment he took his last breath. Mark wanted to start cleaning right away. He needed movement orders, something to keep his hands busy. That was Mark, the practical one. Emily, the youngest, moved slower, touching things like they could still feel her. And me, I just tried to keep the peace like always. "Mark was practical," Emily said once, half smiling. "You kept the peace." I stayed. She wasn't wrong. That was our family's unspoken deal. Dad. George Miller had been a high school history teacher for 35 years. The kind of man who believed every story deserved to be written down neatly in ink, not pencil. His notebooks were stacked in the study, decades of lesson plans, quotes from Lincoln receipts, and notes about the garden. Mom, Laura, had been his opposite, spontaneous, soft-voiced, always with a camcorder in hand. She filmed birthdays, Sunday dinners, even thunderstorms through the porch window. She said one day we'd want to remember how it all sounded. She was right. Mom died in 1999. Dad never really recovered. By the time his health started to fail, Emily had moved back in to take care of him. Mark helped with the bills from afar. I called sometimes. But the truth is, distance had already done its damage. That afternoon, after the funeral guests left, Mark said we should talk about the house. His tone was businesslike, the same voice he used when explaining taxes or mortgages. "It's too big for anyone to keep up," he said. "Dad would have wanted it sold, split the value 3 ways. Emily didn't even look at him. "He lived here until the day he died. He told me he wanted it to stay in the family." "Yeah, Em, but he didn't exactly leave a note on the fridge." Her voice rose. "He didn't have to." I stepped in, hands up. "Hey, not today, all right," Mark sighed, pacing by the window. "It's not about today. It's about being realistic." He had that tone, calm, reasonable, and completely cold. Emily turned away from him toward Dad's favorite chair. "Realistic," she muttered, "is just another word for forgetting." The argument fizzled, but the air stayed sharp. We started cleaning. Boxes of photo albums, drawers of old receipts, stacks of books Dad had underlined 100 times. The house moaned when we walked, the kind of sound that makes you feel like someone's listening. It was Emily who found the box on the attic floor. A plain cardboard box taped, once labeled in Mom's handwriting, "Home Videos, 1998-2002." Inside were a few loose tapes, some family photos, and a small cracked camcorder. She held one tape up to the light. The label read, "Birthday 1998, Dad and the Kids." Mark froze when he saw it. His hand tightened around the ladder rail. "Throw it away," he said. Emily frowned. "It's just a home movie. It's junk, Em. VHS doesn't even play anymore." He turned, heading for the boxes of books, but his voice trembled. "I caught it, that tiny shake he gets when he's not telling the truth." "Mark," Whoopi said quietly. "What's on it?" "Nothing. Too fast, too sharp." He didn't look at me. Emily wiped the dust off the tape, reading the label again. "Mom's handwriting," she said softly. "God, I haven't seen this in years." Mark reached out his hand. "Give it to me." "Why?" "Because I said so." Emily laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You sound just like Dad." Mark's face twitched. For a second I thought he might hit her. Then he dropped his hand and walked away. I looked around the attic, the sunlight slanting through broken shutters, catching on floating dust. Everything felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had shifted closer. That's when I noticed the door to Dad's study downstairs had a new lock, a shiny silver one, different from the brass handles on every other door. "When did you change that?" I asked. Mark didn't answer. He was already halfway down the stairs. Emily followed my gaze. "He did that a few years ago," she said. "Said it was for safety. After the break-in." I nodded, though I remembered there had never been a break-in. Just one night, Dad thought someone had moved his papers. I felt it then, the unease, that quiet, crawling feeling that something wasn't right. We went back to packing, but I couldn't stop looking at that tape. A black rectangle of plastic and dust, harmless in Emily's hands, but somehow heavy. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. I didn't know then that pressing play would change everything we thought we knew about this family. Sometimes the truth doesn't hide in words. It hides in the silence after them. I still remember that birthday 1998. The smell of chocolate frosting, the hum of the ceiling fan, and the flicker of Mom's camcorder light in our faces. She had that thing glued to her hand, like if she kept recording, time would listen. "Say cheese," she said, and Emily barely ate, threw frosting at me instead. Mark rolled his eyes, pretending not to laugh, and Dad, steady as always, lifted his cup of coffee and a mock toast. Mom laughed, that soft, contagious laugh that made the whole house warmer. Then she pointed the camera at Mark. "All right, my serious one, tell me something. Who's going to take care of your dad when I'm gone?" Mark shifted in his chair, embarrassed. "Don't say that, Mom." She zoomed in anyway. "Just say it." He sighed, glanced at Dad, then back at the camera. "I will." He said it like a promise he didn't understand yet. Mom smiled, satisfied, and turned the camera toward Dad. "You heard him, George. That's a binding contract." Dad chuckled, shaking his head. "You're filming too much. Save some tape for next year." Mom winked. "There's always more tape." But there wasn't. She got sick the next spring. Cancer, quick, cruel, merciless. The camcorder stayed on her nightstand, gathering dust. After she passed, no one touched it again. Dad changed after that. He still went to school, still graded papers, still fixed the porch railing when storms tore it down. But something in him turned quiet. The man who used to hum Sinatra while mowing the lawn stopped singing. Dinner became silent, except for the sound of his fork against the plate. Mark moved out first. Found a job 2 towns away. He sent money every month, envelopes addressed neatly in blue ink, always signed, "Take care, Mark." I left soon after, chasing work, chasing space. Emily stayed. She was only 18, but she refused to leave. Said someone had to look after him. Dad used to say that girl's got her mother's spine. Years passed. When Dad started losing his strength, Mark came back wearing a new suit and a sense of importance. He brought papers, documents about refinancing property value taxes. He said they were just to simplify things. I wasn't there, but Emily told me later that Dad had hesitated before signing. He trusted Mark. Always had. Said, "You've got the head for numbers, son." Mark said, "I just want to make sure everything's secure." I guess he did. After that, Dad became more withdrawn. He still kept his notebooks, his small handwriting filling every line. Lists of expenses, garden plans, grocery prices. In one margin, I found something later that stuck with me. If love is real, it should leave proof. I didn't understand it then. The last time I saw him was 2 weeks before he passed. He was sitting on the porch, blanket over his legs, the camcorder beside him like an old friend. We didn't talk much, He asked about work, about Emily, about whether Mark seemed happy. Then he looked at me, that long, steady look that said more than words. "David," he said quietly, "when people start hiding the truth, it's because they're afraid of what love will say about them." I didn't know what he meant until much later. He coughed, smiled faintly, and added, "If truth ever gets buried, let love dig it up." That was the last thing he said to me. In the weeks after Mom's funeral, the house felt smaller, like the air had learned to stay quiet. Dad moved slower. He'd sit at the kitchen table long after breakfast, staring at the chair she used to fill. Sometimes he'd play the old tapes just for the sound of her voice drifting through static. I remember once walking in and hearing her laughter from the living room. For a second I thought she was still there. Then I saw Dad sitting with the remote in his hand, eyes wet but smiling. He didn't notice me. He just whispered, "She always knew how to make this place feel alive." After that, he kept the camcorder on the shelf by the clock, never touching it again. He said it was for safekeeping, but I think it was more like a wound he didn't want to reopen. Emily told me once that when Dad's hands started to tremble, he still tried to write his notes every day, tiny letters like he was fighting time itself. She'd sit across from him, correcting his spelling, pretending not to notice when his pen slipped. That's who she was, gentle patient, too young to be carrying someone else's ending. Sometimes I wonder if we all failed him in different ways. Mark by leaving, me by staying away too long, Emily by never leaving at all. Dad used to say a family isn't who stays in the picture, it's who remembers when it fades. At the time I didn't get it, now I do. We decided to play the tape that night. I wish we hadn't. It was raining outside, the kind of steady whispering rain that makes old houses sound alive. The three of us sat in the living room, Mark in Dad's recliner, Emily cross-legged on the rug, and me leaning against the wall near the light switch. No one spoke for a while. The TV sat on its stand like an altar waiting. The tape player looked ancient, its metal buttons dulled with age. Emily brushed off the dust, slid the VHS inside, and looked back at us. "You ready?" Mark didn't answer. He was staring at the screen, hands clasped tight. When she pressed play, the machine groaned a slow, mechanical sigh. Static filled the room, gray and crackling. Then came the flicker of light. The image steadied a cake with too many candles. A table full of kids. Mom's laugh behind the camera. For a second we all smiled. Then Mark stood. "Turn it off," he said. His voice was too sharp, too controlled. Emily frowned. "It's just a home video, Mark. Why are you—" "'Cause it's old," he snapped. "It could jam. You'll break the player," I said. "Then let it jam. We'll buy a new one." He turned to me. "You don't get it." "No," I said. "I think I do." Emily ignored him, her eyes fixed on the TV. The camera zoomed in on Mom holding a plate of cake, her voice clear and steady. "This house will belong to the one who keeps it alive, not the one who owns it on paper." Her words landed like stones. Emily covered her mouth. That's Mom," she whispered. "She said that, didn't she?" Mark lunged forward and hit stop. The image froze Mom mid-laugh. Candles half burned. "She didn't mean it like that," Mark said. "It was a joke. You know how she was." But no one said anything. In the silence, the rain outside grew louder. Then without warning, the tape started again on its own. Mom's voice returned, same line, slower this time, clearer. "This house will belong to the one who keeps it alive." Emily turned toward Mark. "Why did you tell me it was blank?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Because it doesn't matter. It does to me," she said. "It mattered to her." Mark exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You don't understand how complicated this is." "No," she said. "You made it complicated." I could feel the tension rising, not the kind that ends in shouting, but the kind that ends in regret. Mark stood again, pacing. Dad couldn't manage this place. The taxes, the upkeep, he was drowning. I helped him fix that. By forging a will, I said, before I could stop myself. He froze. Emily's eyes widened. "What did you just say?" she asked. I hesitated. "You told me once, remember, a few years ago. You said Mark needed my signature for some tax paperwork. You sent it through email." Emily's voice cracked. "That wasn't taxes, was it?" Mark didn't answer. The room went still except for the faint whir of the tape rewinding itself. He sank into Dad's chair, rubbing his temples. "I didn't forge it," he said quietly. "I just clarified it. Emily's voice rose. "You changed it, Mark." His voice broke. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. He was confused. He kept saying things that didn't make sense. Emily shook her head, tears welling. He knew exactly what he wanted. You just didn't like hearing it. Mark slammed his hand on the armrest. You think I did this for me? I kept this place from being taken by the bank. I paid the bills. The repairs, Emily cut him off. You paid to own it, not to keep it alive. For a moment, all three of us just breathed heavy, uneven, the kind of silence that feels alive. Then, something strange happened. The TV flickered again, the tape skipping ahead. The image on screen wasn't from the same day. The lighting was dimmer, the walls looked older, and Mom wasn't in the frame anymore. It was Dad, younger than I remembered, sitting at his desk with a notebook open beside him. The timestamp at the corner of the screen read 2002. Emily leaned closer. That's 4 years later. I looked at the tape box on the shelf. The handwriting said 1998, but someone had drawn a line through it and written 2002 above it. Someone recorded over it, I said. Mark stiffened. What? Look, I pointed. That's why the lighting's different. Somebody reused the tape. Dad must have done it, Mark muttered. He filmed everything. Emily shook her head slowly. Dad stopped filming after Mom died. He couldn't even look at the camera. Mark's face lost color. Then who did? No one answered. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thick. On the screen, Dad adjusted his glasses and began to speak. I'm making this note, he said softly, in case my children forget what love looks like when it's tested. Emily gasped. Oh my God. Dad looked straight into the lens. If this house ever becomes a weapon, if it turns brother against sister, then it no longer belongs to anyone. The image froze for a second, then the tape skipped again. Mark grabbed the remote, but Emily caught his arm. No, you owe us this. The next image was of a document, a piece of paper on Dad's desk. The will. His voice continued, trembling slightly. Promises mean nothing when they're rewritten. Mark whispered, Stop it, please. If this were your father forced into silence, what would you do? Would you fight for his words or let them fade? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to follow Echoes of Betrayal for more stories like this. Dad's voice carried through the static. If anyone betrays this promise, let the community know. The tape clicked and stopped. No one moved. Emily was crying silently. Mark sat motionless, hands covering his mouth. The sound of the rain filled the room again, slow and steady. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. Everything Mom had said, everything Dad had feared, it all led here. Emily finally spoke. He knew. Somehow he knew. Mark didn't deny it. He just whispered, I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to get caught, I said. He looked up, eyes red. I thought I was protecting what was ours. Emily turned to him, her face wet but calm. No, Mark, you were protecting what you wanted. He didn't argue. He just sat there staring at the blank TV, breathing like someone trying not to drown. I stood up, but my legs felt weak. The air in that room was heavy grief, guilt, truth, all mixing into something none of us could name. Outside, thunder rolled far off in the distance. Mark whispered almost to himself, If this were your family, would you still press play? I didn't answer. Because I knew I would. The rain went on for hours. None of us moved. The tape sat inside the player like a live grenade, humming softly, waiting for someone to touch it again. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the black screen. He looked smaller somehow, not like the older brother who'd always had the answers, but like a man realizing the ground beneath him had finally given way. Emily broke the silence first. You knew, didn't you? About the recording, Mark didn't look up. I didn't know he said that part. You knew enough, she said. You knew there was something in there you didn't want us to see. He rubbed his face. I wasn't trying to hide Dad's words. I was trying to protect them. Protect them, she repeated. You forged them. Mark's voice cracked. I didn't forge his words. I just made them clearer. Clearer for who I asked quietly. For us or for you. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Emily shook her head. You always thought you were doing what was best for everyone, but really you were just doing what made you feel in control. Mark looked at her, his eyes glassy. Do you have any idea what it's like to feel responsible for everything? For him. For you. For this house, every bill, every call from the doctor. I lived here too, Emily said. I changed his sheets. I listened to him forget my name. You sent checks, Mark. That's not the same thing. He winced like she'd slapped him. Don't do that, he said quietly. Don't make it sound like I didn't care. She stepped closer, voice trembling. You cared about being the good son. That's different from caring about him. The words landed hard. I could almost hear them echo in the room. Mark stood and walked to the window. The glass reflected him older, tired, unrecognizable. For a long moment, he just watched the rain slide down the pane. I thought he said slowly, if I kept the house, I could keep him here somehow. Keep her too. Like, maybe if I owned it, I wouldn't lose them. Emily's voice softened. You already lost them, Mark. We all did. The house doesn't fix that. He turned to us, tears in his eyes now. You don't get it. I was there the day Dad signed the papers. He looked so small. He said, do whatever you think is right. That's all he said. He didn't fight. He just signed. And that made it okay, I asked. Mark shrugged helplessly. It made it real. I told myself he approved. Maybe I needed to believe that. No one spoke. The only sound was the rain and the faint mechanical click of the tape finally stopping. Emily walked over to the shelf and picked up another VHS tape, unlabeled, dusty. She turned it in her hand. There are more, she said softly. There's always more. Mark shook his head. Don't, please. Why not? Because I can't take it anymore. Her tone was sharp now. You mean you can't take being seen? He slammed his hand against the wall. Enough. The sound echoed through the house. I stepped between them. Stop it, both of you. Emily backed away, breathing fast. You lied, Mark. You made him sign something he didn't understand. You made me believe we were all equal in this. I didn't lie, Mark said. I just didn't tell you everything. Same thing she said flatly. Mark looked down, his hands trembling. You think I don't hate myself for it? Emily's voice cracked. Then why did you hide it? He looked up, eyes burning. Because once you start lying, you forget how to stop. That shut everyone up. He turned to me. You think you're any better, Dave? You left. You ran the minute things got heavy. Don't act like you carried any of this. He wasn't wrong. The truth hurt because it wasn't just his. I said quietly, maybe running was my version of lying. That made him pause. The fight drained out of him. Emily sank into the couch, covering her face with her hands. Her voice was small now. He didn't deserve this. Dad trusted us to do better. Mark sat down beside her, the anger gone, replaced by exhaustion. I thought I was doing better. I really did. For a while, none of us spoke. The house creaked as the storm outside softened into drizzle. It felt like even the walls were listening. Finally, I said, there's one thing we haven't asked. Emily looked up. Who recorded over the tape? She frowned. You think it wasn't Dad? I don't know, I said. But the handwriting on that label 2002, it's not his. His 2's always looped at the top. That one didn't. Mark's eyes widened. You're saying someone else touched it? Someone, I said, or maybe sometime later. Emily opened the case again, running her fingers along the plastic edge. Maybe he asked someone to film it for him, she said. A neighbor, a friend. Or maybe I said he wanted us to find it this way years later when we'd need to. The thought hung there heavy and haunting. Mark whispered, if that's true, he knew exactly what would happen. Emily met his eyes. He always did. Mark rubbed his face again, tears mixing with rainwater dripping from the ceiling. Do you think he forgave me? I didn't answer. Forgiveness was too big a word for that room. Emily whispered, he left the proof. That's how he forgave us, by letting the truth stay alive. Mark nodded slowly, like he was trying to believe it. I went to the player, pressed eject, and took the tape in my hands. It was warm, maybe from the machine, maybe from everything it carried. Keep it, Emily said softly. I hesitated. Why me? Because you're the only one who doesn't want the house, she said. Mark almost smiled, a tired, broken smile. She's right. You're neutral. I slid the tape back into its box. It's not about being neutral, I said. It's about remembering what it cost. The clock struck midnight. The storm had stopped. Outside, the streetlight flickered through the rain-streaked window, pale and thin. Mark leaned back, closing his eyes. I just wanted to keep something from falling apart. Emily whispered, You did. You just didn't know it would be us. He nodded, a tear sliding down his cheek. I'm sorry, he said. It didn't fix anything, but it was something. I looked around the room. The old photos, the piles of unopened mail, the dust that still carried Dad's scent. For the first time, the house didn't feel angry. It just felt tired. We stayed in that room until the first light of morning. No one spoke, not even when the storm outside finally gave up. The world felt quieter, heavier, like it was mourning with us. The air smelled of damp carpet and cold coffee. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest. Mark sat on the floor, his back against Dad's recliner, eyes half open, but seeing nothing. I stood by the window watching the sky turn from black to blue. Every corner of the room looked different in daylight, softer, smaller, almost peaceful. But the tape sat on the table like a wound that wouldn't close. Mark broke the silence first. "What do we do now?" I turned toward him. "About what?" He looked at the box. "About all of this. The house, the will, everything." Emily stirred, her voice groggy. "We don't do anything. We just know." Mark frowned. "That's not enough." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "It's the only thing we've ever had that's honest." He looked down at his hands, nodding slowly. "I ruined that, didn't I?" I didn't answer. Some truths don't need confirmation. They just hang in the air until they sink in. He laughed bitterly. "You know what's funny? I spent years trying to keep this family together. But I'm the one who tore it apart," Emily said softly. "You didn't tear it apart. You just showed the cracks that were already there." He looked at her, almost grateful. "That's worse." I walked to the table and picked up the VHS again. The plastic felt colder now, heavier. Maybe I said this is what Dad meant when he said truth should leave proof. Mark raised his eyes. "You think he planned this for us to find it?" "I think he hoped we would," I said. "He wanted the truth to stay somewhere we couldn't edit it." Emily smiled faintly. "Guess he knew us too well." Mark leaned his head back, closing his eyes. "I can't stay here." "Then don't," I said gently. "Go home. Rest." He nodded, looking broken but lighter somehow. "I'll transfer the house deed back to all of us, equal share." Emily shook her head. "That's not what matters. I know," he said, "but it's something." He stood up, walked to the TV and unplugged it. The click echoed through the room, small but final. Then he looked at us. "I'll come by next week. Maybe we can clean the place together." "Maybe," I said. He left quietly, his shoes squeaking on the wet porch. Through the window I watched him walk to his car. He paused once, looking back at the house, then drove away. For a long time, neither of us moved. Emily went to the window beside me, her voice soft. "Do you think he meant it? About what? About fixing things?" I shrugged. "I think he's scared enough to try." She nodded slowly. "Maybe that's how it starts." The morning light fell across the room, landing on Dad's empty chair. For the first time in years, the house felt like it could breathe again. Emily took the tape from my hand and slid it back into the box. "We should keep it," she said. "Not for proof, for memory." I nodded. For memory. We stood there for a while, watching the dust spin in the sunlight, and for a brief, fragile moment it almost felt like the house forgave us. Morning came slowly, as if the house wasn't ready to wake up. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving a thin film of mist over the windows. I could still smell the damp wood, the faint trace of coffee that had gone cold sometime before dawn. Emily was still asleep on the couch, curled under one of Dad's old blankets. Mark was gone. His mug sat on the table, half empty, a small ring of brown circling the rim, like evidence that he'd been real. I moved quietly, stacking the empty boxes, gathering the tapes, trying not to make a sound. The air felt different, lighter somehow. The anger that had filled the room the night before had burned itself out, leaving only the smell of dust and a kind of sad calm. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. It hadn't done that in months. Dad always wound it every Sunday, and when he passed, the ticking stopped. This morning it started again on its own. For a moment I wondered if that meant something. Maybe the house had decided to breathe again. I sat down in Dad's chair and looked around. The sun had begun to slip through the blinds, tracing lines of light across the floor. It made the dust sparkle, tiny floating ghosts that refused to settle. Dad used to say, "One day truth will ask for rent." I never understood that when I was young. Now I do. He didn't mean money. He meant that the truth always comes back for what it's owed, even if it takes years to collect. Maybe that's what scared me most. The truth isn't something you find. It's something that finds you. You can bury it under years, under guilt, under good intentions, but it always remembers the way home. All those years I spent away thinking I'd escape the house, I was really just circling it from a distance. Every lie, every silence, it was rent unpaid. And Dad was right. Truth always asks for what it's owed. It doesn't knock. It just waits until you're tired enough to open the door. We'd all been paying for it in our own ways. Mark with guilt, Emily with loyalty, and me with distance. I reached over and opened one of Dad's notebooks. The handwriting was small, neat, painfully deliberate. On the first page, he'd written, "If love doesn't make you honest, it will make you lonely." I closed it slowly. That sounded like something he wrote near the end. I remembered how he used to sit at the porch in the evenings, hands clasped, watching the sky fade. He'd ask me to join him sometimes. We wouldn't talk much. He'd just nod toward the trees and say, "You hear that? That's what silence sounds like when it means something." Back then I thought he was just being poetic. Now I know he was teaching me how to listen. The night before still replayed in my head Mark's face when the truth hit him. Emily's tears, Dad's voice breaking through the static. It wasn't just a recording. It was a confession, a warning, and a gift all at once. I realized I didn't hate Mark. I pitied him, because in his own way, he was trying to do what we all do, fix what's already broken, even if it means breaking it more. The house wasn't ours to own. It was ours to remember. I went to the window and opened the blinds a little wider. Sunlight poured in, touching the photos on the wall. Birthdays, graduations, that camping trip in '96, where we all got sunburned. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to look away. Emily stirred, opening her eyes. Her voice was hoarse. "He's gone?" "Yeah," I said softly. "He'll be back next week." She nodded, rubbing her eyes. "Do you think he'll really change?" "I think he already did," I said. "Last night changed all of us." She sat up and looked around the room. "It feels different," she said. "Yeah," I said, "like it's listening." She smiled faintly, went to the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The sound of dripping water filled the quiet like a heartbeat. She handed me a cup and sat across from me at the table. Neither of us said much. There was nothing left to argue about. After a while, she whispered, "You think Dad planned this? I thought about that for a long time. I think he left us the kind of truth that doesn't rot," I said. "Just waits." Emily nodded slowly, eyes on her cup. He knew we'd come back here, even after he was gone. "Maybe that's what he wanted," I said. "Not forgiveness, just for us to finally show up." The house creaked softly the way old wood does when the temperature shifts. It almost sounded like approval. Outside, the sky was clearing. The rainwater glistened on the porch railing, the garden bright with morning dew. The world felt fragile, but alive. Emily said, "You're staying for a while, right?" "Yeah," I said. "I think I will." She smiled, relief in her eyes. Then she reached for Dad's notebook and slid it toward me. "Maybe you should keep this one." I hesitated. "It's his." "It's ours now," she said. I opened it again, flipping through pages filled with numbers, names, tiny bits of thought. Halfway through, I found a note written in red ink. "If truth ever gets buried, let love dig it up." I smiled, not because it made me happy, but because it made sense. Everything he'd ever said suddenly did. I looked at Emily. "Maybe love isn't about keeping the house," I said. "Maybe it's about keeping the echoes alive." She nodded. "Then let's make sure they stay loud." We sat there for a long time, sipping coffee, while the house settled around us. No shouting, no lies, no ghosts left to wake. Just truth finally breathing on its own. Would you forgive someone who buried the truth if they finally dug it up for you? The house felt different in the days that followed. Not louder, just awake. Sunlight reached corners that had been gray for years. The air smelled faintly of polish and soap instead of dust. Emily hummed while she cleaned, and for once I didn't mind the sound. I stayed longer than I planned. Every morning I walked the same hallway Dad used to, touching the frames on the wall, reading the tiny notes taped behind them. Dates, places, prices. He wrote everything down. Maybe he was afraid that one day we'd forget the small details that held a life together. It's strange how a house feels different when truth moves in. You can almost hear it settling into the wall, soft but certain. I still couldn't bring myself to rewatch the tape. Once was enough, but I kept it near on the shelf by the window, not as proof, more like company. On the third morning, someone knocked on the door. When I opened it, I saw Mrs. Ruth standing there clutching a tin of lemon bars and wearing her old church hat. She'd lived across the street for as long as I could remember. Dad used to fix her fence every spring. "Well, I'll be," she said, smiling. "I heard you were back." I smiled faintly, trying to help Emily get the place together. She looked past me into the hallway. "Looks cleaner already. Your father would have liked that." Her eyes softened. "He told me once that you boys might find something after he was gone. Said it'd be in his desk drawer." That made me pause. "You sure?" She nodded. Said, "When they stop fighting, they'll be ready for it. Guess that time's come." She handed me the tin, gave a small pat to my arm, and left. I stood there for a long moment before walking to the study. Dad's desk was old oak, scarred and solid. The top drawer was empty except for a few pens and a folded envelope taped to the bottom. It was yellowed, sealed, and labeled in his handwriting. "For my children, when the house is quiet again." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single page written in the same deliberate strokes he used for his lesson plans. "To my children. If this ever reaches you, it means the house still stands, and so does what's broken between you. I've watched you all try to protect something you can't own. You've fought for walls, not for each other. Mark fears losing what he's built. Emily fears being forgotten. And David, you fear coming home. The truth is, I never cared who the deed belonged to. The house was never the inheritance. It was the proof that you once loved the same thing. Don't waste that proof fighting over its price. If you must keep something, keep each other. That's all that matters. Dad." I sat there for a long time reading those lines again and again until the paper softened in my hands. He knew everything. Every fear, every silence, every small betrayal. He'd seen it all coming. The letter didn't accuse. It forgave. I folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and set it beside the VHS tape. Then I sat back in his chair and let the quiet stretch out. Outside, Emily was trimming the hedges, her hair tied up, sleeves rolled high. She waved through the window. I waved back. That afternoon, Mark showed up. No warning, no call, just the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway. For a second, my stomach tightened, expecting another argument. But when he walked in, he wasn't carrying papers or folders. He had a small wooden toolbox in his hand. "Thought I'd fix that loose step on the porch," he said. I nodded. "You remember how?" He smiled faintly. I watched Dad do it enough times. Emily came out to meet him. No tension, no sharp words, just a small, careful smile. They worked together for a while, Mark hammering Emily, holding the board steady. The sound echoed through the yard, rhythmic and familiar. I sat on the steps watching them. It felt like the house was listening, approving. When they were done, we sat together on the porch. The sun was dropping low, painting the front yard gold. For a long time, no one said anything. Emily broke the silence first. "He'd like this, wouldn't he?" I said. A quiet house finally doing what it was built for, holding us together. Mark rubbed his palms on his jeans. I was going to bring the deed forms, but I think I'll wait. Emily nodded. "Maybe this is enough." He looked at her. "I don't deserve enough." She reached out, touched his hand. "Neither do I. That's why we start over." For a moment I thought he might cry, but instead he laughed, quiet, shaky, real. We watched the sky shift from orange to gray, and for the first time, silence didn't feel heavy. It just felt honest. Later that night, I placed Dad's letter inside the same box as the tape. I labeled it Keepers. Not for anyone else, just for us, I whispered to the empty room. We buried too many words in this house. Maybe this time we'll let them breathe. The walls seemed to hold that thought like they'd been waiting for it. If you found a letter that could heal your family, would you read it or burn it? A week later, I came back to the house alone. Mark and Emily had gone back to their lives, promising to visit soon. The place was quiet again, not the kind of quiet that hurts, but the kind that waits. The porch step Mark fixed still creaked a little. I didn't mind. It sounded like a heartbeat. Inside, everything looked settled. The box labeled Keepers sat on the table just where I'd left it. I dusted the surface, then sat down and stared at it for a long time. I should have felt peace. But something tugged at me, a question I hadn't let myself ask. If Dad recorded that letter years ago, why leave the tape unlabeled for so long? And why was the handwriting that said 2002 so uneven? I opened the box again, pulled out the VHS. The label was faint, but under the words, Birthday, 1998 and 2002. There was another mark, a name scratched in pencil, nearly invisible unless the light hit it just right. It said, Ruth. I stared at it, my mind racing. Mrs. Ruth, the neighbor. The one who told me about the drawer. The one who always seemed to know too much. Why would her name be on Dad's tape? I set it in the player. For a moment I hesitated, hand hovering over play. The last time I pressed that button, everything changed. But curiosity has its own gravity. I pressed it. The screen flickered static, then a faint image. It wasn't Dad. It was Ruth sitting at the same desk, the same chair, holding the camera toward herself. Her voice trembled. If you're watching this, then your father asked me to finish what he couldn't. He said some truths need witnesses. I leaned closer. She smiled sadly. He told me to record this the day before he changed his will. The tape cracked with static. Her next words were almost lost beneath the noise. But he made another copy, one he never gave to Mark. The image froze. Then the tape stopped with a click. I sat there, the silence pressing down on me. Outside wind moved through the trees, low, steady, almost like a voice. Maybe it was the house again. Or maybe it was something still waiting to be heard. Voices fade, but guilt echoes louder. If you were in my place, would you press play one more time or walk away forever? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to follow Echoes of Betrayal for the next story. Thank you for watching.